Thank you all. Welcome to everyone. I'm so glad to see you. My name is Greg Reish, and I'm the director of the Center for Popular Music here at Middle Tennessee State University. The CPM is one of the oldest and largest research centers devoted to the study of American vernacular music in its full breadth right here at MTSU. So for more info, please follow us on social media or go to mtsu.edu/popmusic, and Michelle's going to put that link into the chat for you. Very easy to find. Learn more about us. A reminder that this session is being recorded. If you would like to change your Zoom name, you can do so by hovering over your photo and clicking on rename. Please feel free to include gender pronouns if you wish. We ask that you keep yourself muted throughout the events unless you are invited to speak. We encourage participation in the chat. We will have a Q&A at the end of the panel discussion, so you can either save your questions for the Q&A at the end or feel free to put them in the chat at any point, and it would be helpful if you write question for speaker or something like that at the beginning, that we'll know exactly what your intentions are. I'd like to thank first and foremost our panelists today, all of whom will be properly introduced in just a moment. Huge thanks today to our moderator, Michelle Conceison, who worked tirelessly to make this event happen. Michelle and I would like to thank a few others for their support of this event. John Merchant, chair of the Recording Industry Department here at MTSU, Dean Beverly Keel and Rachel Helms in the College of Media and Entertainment, Olivia Beaudry and Yvonne Elliott from the Center for Popular Music staff, Roberta Chevret and Vicki McLean from MTSU's Women's and Gender Studies program, Adele Monteblanco in the Department of Sociology, Adonija Bakari from MTSU's Africana Studies Department, Megan Whipfley at the June Anderson Center, and Rhonda King in MTSU Alumni Relations. Thanks to all of you. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Michelle.
Well, thank you, Greg, and thank you so much for your help in making this happen. So great. I teach music marketing, concert promotion, entrepreneurship, artist management, and recording in the recording industry program, all the businessy stuff. For accessibility and way of description, I'm a white woman with brown hair, blue glasses, and blue shirt, and I have a chalkboard background. Before we begin, let's take a moment to acknowledge we're gathering today in a setting. So we're coming from across MTSU's campus, Murfreesboro, Tennessee, state of Tennessee, North Carolina, across the United States and beyond this area. And we're using technology that's not available for everyone. We recognize the importance and complexity of land acknowledgements in the context of virtual learning, online events, organizing, and collaboration. I invite you to join in acknowledging our shared responsibility to use this time together well, and for each of us to consider our roles in reconciliation, decolonization, and active allyship. I am tuning in from Nashville. It is the traditional territory of the Shawnee, Yuchi, and Eastern Band of Cherokee people. I invite you to use the chat throughout this event, but also to introduce yourself and share your acknowledgements, thoughts, and questions throughout the event. If you're not sure about your land acknowledgement, you can find out more at native-land.ca, and Greg will post that link in the chat for you. So let's get started. I am trying to contain my excitement. It's my honor to introduce our speakers and moderate this conversation. I'm excited to welcome to the stage, though there is no stage, Kim Ruehl. Kim Ruehl is a music journalist, former editor of the Music Magazine and Roots Music Journal. I'm going to add a spotlight, Kim. Yeah. Music journal No Depression, and author of the book that just came out at the end of March, A Singing Army, Zilphia Horton and the Highlander Folk School. She joins us today from Asheville, North Carolina, I think. Yes, great. I know you hail there, but you never know where someone's today. Also, please welcome the Highlander Research and Education Center co-directors from Newmarket, Tennessee. We've got Adding spotlight, Ashley Henderson. Ashley Woodard Henderson is the first Black woman to serve as co-executive director of Highlander. She's on multiple leadership teams at the Movement for Black Lives, including Vision for Black Lives and the Breathe Act. She's served on councils for organizations including the Southern Movement Assembly, the National Bailout Collective, and the Front Line. She is a lifelong activist, an amazing human, fighting for workers' rights, for environmental justice, reproductive justice, LGBTQIA rights, and more. And I can't wait for y'all to hear her speak. Welcome, Ashley, and also welcome Reverend Allyn Maxfield-Steele. Has been the co-executive director of Highlander since 2017. His movement work is focused on connecting people and grassroots communities to one another through high school and college education, faith and spiritual leadership, capacity building, and organizing on a range of front lines throughout the US, South, Appalachia, and globally. Welcome, Kim, Ashley, and Allyn. Amazing. You may unmute yourselves. You've been muted. I think when we let everybody in, you may have been muted. So as you wish, feel free to unmute yourself. We've organized this conversation in 3 parts. So we're going to start by talking about mission and history of the Highlander. We're going to talk about protest and civil action. We're going to talk about music and social justice. And as Greg told y'all earlier, we are going to have Q&A. So please feel free to join that as well. So starting with the mission and history of Highlander. Let's just start at the basics. What is Highlander in briefest? What is the center's mission and history? We're also going to put a video in the chat that folks can watch later. Folk Alliance International made a pretty great video kind of about a bit of the history, and Zilphia is in there as well. But I wonder if one of y'all could just give our community the quick skinny on the center's mission and history.
Sure. I mean, Allyn, we can rock, paper, scissors for it if you want to.
Kick
it off and then I'll follow you.
Sure. Yeah. Highlander's a school. We always have been a school. We've had 2 names because the state of Tennessee stole the first name from us back in 1961. But we're a school that works with young people across generations to build social movements, and we are a school that supports grassroots leaders. We understand ourselves as a catalyst for social movements and a catalyst for grassroots leadership. And our priority is on the South and Appalachia, and Highlander's always been in East Tennessee. We were in Grundy County back in the day, which is in between Chattanooga and Nashville. We were forcibly removed from our first home to Knoxville, Tennessee, which was a home for Highlander for about a decade. And then a combination of clan attacks, state attacks, local attacks, and then also the interest of having a little bit more space moved us to where we are today, our longest serving home in Newmarket, Tennessee. We've always been residential. We welcome people, not in the pandemic time. In the pandemic time, we're taking care of some stuff on the land that we want to take care of. But we've always been a place that brings people together across difference to talk about building social movements. And I'll kick it to Ash if there's anything that I missed.
Yeah, I mean, if I was saying it as concisely as possible, I would say that we are a school that's been bringing people together across difference to build generational cohorts of folks who save the world. That's what we do across their differences, across geography, and that's had particular impact on the South as a place-based organization in Appalachia that has national and international consequence and impact. So Highlander is as strong as the most supported grassroots community that's fighting to change their material conditions themselves. That's what we do. We support those folks.
Brilliant. I don't know about anybody else who got chills when she said save the world, but I think what is beautiful about how you both describe that is so how tangible and how aspirational the mission is, right? and the residential nature, talking about people coming together and being in a space. And Kim, that's really in your book. I mean, just sort of the experience of even going and researching and being there, and what that is like when you're saving the world, changing the world, and striving for what you're striving for in a space, in a room together. I'm curious, and I throw this to anyone, what role have college students played in social justice and civil rights movements? What role have women played, both in movements and at Highlander? And we can take those questions together or separately, however you'd like to do it.
Yeah, I'll take a first crack. I mean, if you don't know about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, you don't know about social movements in the US South. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was a crew of young Black radical students from particularly Middle Tennessee, but also across the South, that Highlander accompanied and supported. But during the 50s and 60s, they built up one of the predecessors of what is today the Movement for Black Lives. So I would say that that's one thing, is that you can understand student work and college student movements as being at the forefront of some of the most radical progressive change in the history of this country, but I would argue also worldwide. And that's just one example. So yeah, I'll take that from the student perspective. There are lots of other ways of looking at that too.
Yeah, I mean, I think you also can't talk about like the 60s and 70s without talking about the fact that like the student organizing committee, right? Like SOC, young white college students that made their home and particularly in Central Appalachia to do this work of undoing white supremacy and building social movement. You know, thinking about folks like Students for a Democratic Society, who some of y'all might know as a contemporary, like, you know, series of chapter-based college organizations, but has been around for a long time, longer than I've been alive. So there's a billion and one examples, not only in a US context, but also globally, of young people that were college students and young people that were not college students organizing social movements and helping to sustain them. But I think the methodology of Highlander is that this work has to be intergenerational, right? That young people have a particular role to play, and so do elders, and so do folks in between. So do the little bitty people that are not students yet, who literally hold me and Allyn to account on a regular basis, both in our homes and in our work. So this work has to be intergenerational, and that's actually what sustains social movements across generations. So that's our methodology. We do intergenerational work that in no small way is led by collegiates and young people of all stripes, but is also very much intergenerational. And then I think to your point, Michelle, about women, it's like, I just want to make it clear, there would be no Highlander Research and Education Center without women. And to be even more specific, there would be no Highlander Research and Education Center without Black women. In fact, I would argue, and I'm curious to hear what Kim says, because I feel like we talk about it a lot, but I would also go even further to argue that you would not know who Zilphia Horton was if it weren't for Black women. That you don't get popular music, you don't get folk, there is no folk music, there is no root music, there ain't no country and old time without Black folks, period, point blank. I think that the history of the Highlander Center proves it, right? You've got, you know, the story of Rosa Parks coming and training at the Highlander Center before the Montgomery bus boycott, which arguably was one of the world's most brilliant tactical interventions. And if you haven't studied it, you ought to. But what you don't necessarily hear is that she went on to be a board member of the Highlander Center, right? She literally spent most of the rest of her life supporting the infrastructure of the Black liberation struggle and the Southern freedom movement. You know, we hear about Septima Clark, the world's greatest teacher, right? Who was teaching people and bringing people together across difference to educate them, some of whom were totally illiterate, but functionally in terms of people power were very literate, very wealthy, to change society for the better before the internet, before cell phones, before social media. She was training hundreds of thousands of people. You might even know that story, but you might not know that her and Miss Clark, or Miss Clark and Miss Parks served on the board of directors together, right? So literally these Black women, not even, just to name a couple, not even to name all of the other women like Jane Sapp, the great cultural organizer, and so many others who literally put blood, sweat, and tears into making sure that the institution was sustained and that it was available and accessible to grassroots communities all over the region. So I think there's no small story to tell. We don't have enough time to talk about all of the women of color and all of the working class white women who literally are the reason why you can enjoy the sacred space that is the Highlander Center today.
There's a couple things I want to follow up on from things you've said just then, Ashley. One is, and Kim, I'm coming to you next. The second thing of follow-up is coming to you, don't worry. But one of the things you said in passing was this relationship, the intergenerational relationship, and the ways in which you and Allyn are maybe called to task at times. And I wonder if we could talk about that for a minute. I feel that in my classroom in a good way. I think it's an interesting dynamic, and I'm curious. I think it's good for students to hear how people feel when that happens. Like if that were to be encouraged, how do you feel about it? Like, in what ways does that, maybe a story would help actually, but like, in what ways does that happen in your experiences? And anyone can answer this. Kim, you might have experience with this too. So I'm just following up on something Ashley has said, but anyone, this intergenerational piece, and when is calling in constructive? And how can students learn how to do that in a way that fosters intergenerational collaboration as opposed to alienation of each other? Not a question given in advance, just throw it, but it's come up.
I have a lot of, again, I think this is like, people have whole panels and write whole books about stuff.
Every question I'm asking you could be a whole conversation.
Small piece.
Oh yeah.
I would say a couple of things. One is, I would say that there's this really brilliant scholar, Norma Wong, and she talks about conflict as a means by which we see where we aren't whole yet, right? Conflict is not innately a bad thing. Conflict is where we see where we are not yet whole. And that if we actually pay attention to the conflict and repair where we aren't whole, we might fool around and be stronger than we were before we recognize that there was a place of not wholeness, right? So I want to start there, because I feel like all too often people talk about conflict or this call in or call out culture in ways that actually don't make any strategic sense for us being more powerful. I want to start there. So especially for you young folks like I'm going to claim youngness since Charlie Biggs is on the call. Hey, Charlie. I'm going to claim my youngness, but I also recognize I might be older than some of y'all on this call, and that's fine too. I'm 35. What I want to say is that all too often when young people raise critique, people say that they're calling folks out, or they say that they're being divisive, when actually the system of oppression that they're trying to usurp is what's divisive. So when young people say that what is happening in the academy or anywhere else is white supremacy, the young people that are calling out white supremacy are not divisive. White supremacy is. When women are saying that systems of oppression like patriarchy need to be usurped and confronted, that is not them being divisive. That is, in fact, patriarchy and misogynoir being divisive. When trans and homosexual folks, when queers and LGBTQ+ folks are saying that we need to challenge our cisgender patriarchy, challenge our heteronormativity, that is not them being divisive. That is a system that we have inherited, creating chaos and confusion and divisiveness. Our job is to do what we need to do to confront, tell the truth, create justice towards reconciliation in that, to remember how we were before these systems of oppression existed. So to Michelle's point about a story, how does it feel when you get called in? Well, an example, the one I think Michelle is alluding to, is that we have a children's justice camp at the Highlander Center. And it is young, Allyn's laughing because he already knows the story. So it's like young people, like when I say young, I mean like the actual young people, like 6 to 12, right, Allyn? 6 to 12, somewhere in that range. They're little bitties. And these young people come, and when we say we believe in youth autonomous programming, we mean they create the programming. So they literally decided what they wanted to learn. And that this one particular year, it might have even been our first or second year as executive directors of the center, they decided they wanted to talk about like how to save the planet, like environmental, economic stuff, but mostly environmental and ecological stuff. And so they decided that they wanted to march. They wanted to learn about direct action. How do you take these values that you have and turn it into power building and challenging authority that doesn't do what you think they ought to do in relationship to making the planet a better place. And they decided that we needed at the Highlander Center to use environmentally friendly cleaning products. They hadn't yet done the investigation to know that we already were, but they had a vision. And me and Allyn had a very long year, a very long week, and a very long day. I had just left the facilities and I was headed back to my house, and I was scrolling through my Facebook feed and I saw a picture on one of our staff's timelines of these little bitty kids with protest signs that they had handmade protesting in front of my office. So I texted Allyn and I said, "What the hell is happening?" And he was like, I'm not doing this today. I'm not doing this today. And I told our staff not like to not bend, right? I was like, no, if these young people want to protest, they picked the right target. That was good. Shout out to them. But I'm not sending them back to community thinking that it's okay to just throw this tactical spaghetti at the wall and hope that something sticks. They need to go back and do their research and come back again, right? But what we didn't do was just ignore them. And ultimately what happened was our staff thought they were so cute that they just went ahead and conceded to the demands, even though we were already doing it. So what we could have done was got all in our feelings about the fact that these young people protested. Instead, we saw everything as a learning opportunity, and an opportunity for us to even be sharper about how we articulate to people what we did do, right? I think there's just something real about what it means to be committed to being in right relationship, even through disagreement and conflict, because it sees an opportunity for us to struggle towards being stronger together and more powerful and sharper in terms of the tactical interventions that we make. So what I love about, the sort of relationships that Highlander has is that, though it is a challenge sometimes to be expected to be all things to all movements at all times, what is real is that because we have that relationship with social movements and have those relationships in intergenerational ways, not only can we can help support people that are trying to figure out how to live in the past, present, and future all at the same time every day, right? But also help them understand how we can get to the wins quicker and sustain them longer through being in right relationship with each other and learning from each other. I don't know if there's more you would add, Allyn. I think that's the story that Michelle was trying to.
No, that's one of my favorite stories. I remember that day very well. I think another story that I'll keep brief is it's about all of that Ash just talked about. I think it's also about what it means to pay attention to what young people are naming, and not only individual young people or groups of young people across generation, but also what they are in their communities are naming, right? So it's like Highlander works at a regional, national, international level. And what we know is happening in one part of the South isn't necessarily the same for the rest of the South, but what might be connecting people together is common. And so one example that comes up for me is just our response to the virus, a response to the pandemic. It was our young people and their families across the region, Black and brown young people, who were naming the particular vulnerabilities that they had experienced as historically and contemporarily marginalized folk, not only because of their race, but also because of their demographic, because of the communities that we're in, saying that this pandemic is going to hit us hard. And we want y'all to take seriously the question about whether you're going to gather people in person. It was the young people and their families that we listened to that helped us get ahead of protocols, not in a competition sense by any means, but just to start asking ourselves, are we listening in the right kind of way to what might be coming down the pike? And I think our young people, I think the staff at Highlander that run our Seeds of Fire program and that coordinate that, and their families in different communities across the region. And I think it's because of the methodology of intergenerational work that helps guide the way that we make decisions that don't privilege folks who are typically in power or in formal power about their authorization or their authority to say what is true, but rather listen across different realities, and particularly listening to people and young people and their families about what's coming down the pike. And I think that to me is among the best things that we can be trying to pay attention to, is like not say the children of the future. I think that's true. It's true. But really be leaning into the fact that no, the very present reality of what it means to be a young person, or what it means to be an elder, whatever that might mean across generation, is what we need to be really zeroing in on. Is like, what is the present reality of this person's material conditions, spiritual conditions, economic conditions, and how do we work together to shift that?
Yeah, I think what makes Highlander so special is that we understand that anybody can have a bad idea, right? Anybody. Age does not preclude you from having bad ideas. I have bad ideas every day. Allyn checks me on my bad ideas often. But what we also recognize is that the opposite of that is also true, that everybody, literally everybody, can have a good idea. And that, quite frankly, most of our ideas become much better when we can be in conflict and shared learning and building relationship with each other.
Well, speaking of ideas that spark and take hold, and a decade later you publish a book, I'm gonna pull Kim into this conversation. Kim, I wonder if you could tell us. We mentioned Zilphia Horton earlier, and I wonder if you could tell us who was Zilphia Horton, and what does it mean to recenter someone's voice or voices? In fact, Ashley is pointing to some other voices that need to be centered in that story. But could you tell us who was Zilphia, and talk to us about recentering voices?
Yeah, Zilphia was the original director of culture at Highlander. She came in about 2 years, 4 months after it opened, and very quickly married Miles Horton, who was the founder of the school, co-founder of the school with Don West. And they married very quickly after like 3 weeks of knowing each other, with this intention of, that she would, direct what was happening outside of the education space, and he would direct the education space. And also with the intention of modeling what it looks like for adults to live like unpacking or dismantling oppressive systems. So their idea of this equitable marriage in 1935 was that they wanted to model for people who were coming, who, by the way, at the time, Grundy County was the 11th poorest county in the country, in the middle of the Great Depression. You want people to come away from their home in the middle of the Great Depression and travel out to Mont Eagle for 6 weeks of, unlearning what they think they know about how the world's supposed to be and who they think they are, and, all that kind of stuff. So Miles and Zilphia intentionally entering this marriage to model change making was a big part of her role there. And she happened to be a classical musician and an artist of all kinds of art. She worked in theater. She worked with, she was an incredible cook and really strategically used food and meals, especially inviting people to her house for meals, to try and get to dig deeper than people were able to get at the school in the daytime. And she's square dancing, she's all kinds of stuff. And so she sort of pioneered at Highlander, in the context of Highlander, the strategic use of arts and culture for movement building. But Zilphia, I just want, like Ashley's question, I was thinking, I turned the manuscript in 2 years ago, and I went through this whole process of how to tell this story was really the bulk of my 10 years, because there are so many avenues for this. And I finally decided no story exists. Let me just tell the birth to death story and hope that somebody else picks this up and goes deeper and further and does better and more. And so that was finally my decision, but especially with what has happened with the incredible leadership in the movement for Black Lives and how it's taken over. My mother knows the issues now. My mother wants to defund the police. Like, that's huge, man. And so knowing that, like, I wish if I could go back and write a couple more chapters, like I would insert other things. But Zilphia really, she grew up in Northwest Arkansas. She didn't know any Black folks. She didn't know any brown folks. She was the boss's daughter, and her introduction to the idea it was Jim Crow South in the 20s. The idea of desegregation was after college, when she was going to integrated Bible study sessions at her pastor's house in Paris, Arkansas. Claude Williams, who got kicked out of town for doing that. But that was her introduction to, like, oh, there's this whole other culture, like there's a whole other side to Jim Crow, and where these people need to be heard and followed and listened to. And so she made it part of her work to try to communicate through music. And I talk about this a little bit in the book, like how she would practice trying to sing like a Black woman was her intention. And, because she knew she had 5 minutes, she's going to sing a song for people to get them to sing with her. She wanted to communicate in that song. No More Mourning was one of them, but there were a lot of them that she learned from those Black youth in Arkansas, that she wanted to communicate. This is from Black culture, and there is wealth and richness and importance in that culture, and I'm going to put it all I can into this song so that you look for it, so that you can see that in people of color next time you encounter them. Like, she was really intentional about it. But that was about as far as she was able to see into that, because at the time the staff was all white, and they were in a town with no Black residents, and until the 40s when they started having, they had integrated meetings as early as 1935, but they started having integrated residential sessions. That all sort of changed, and sort of, they started actively pursuing Black leadership and pursuing civil rights, what became the civil rights movement of the 60s. But yeah, it was really interesting to me to see, as a Southern white liberal, to dig into this woman, like, what did she understand about race and racism, and what was happening in the South at the time? How exposed was she? There's a chance her mother was sewing the Klan robes in Paris, Arkansas. So, what was her awareness, and what was her feeling about all of that? And there was not really any hardcore information about, like, what her journey was with racism, and her role in its perpetuation in the South, except that she would write occasionally, like, she couldn't believe that anybody had racist thoughts. Like, she didn't understand why anybody would think that way or behave that way. So I so wish I could have sat down and talked to her and asked her some questions and gotten into that with her. I got into it with her sister and with the family a little bit, but that's all, their assumption or their understanding of it. So, yeah, I think what Ashley's saying is really interesting. Like, when Septima came, Zilphia was like, loved her, they were friends. She was sort of like, tell me what to do, where do I go? She was ready to follow her. And that's as much as I know about that direct relationship.
Well, let me just throw this out there. I was planning this for later, but I feel like it's an important moment now of, and this was kind of a question I thought I'd ask him, but I'm going to put it to the room here, to all three of you. what role do you think understanding history plays? Every single question I ask you is a whole movie. I mean, I'm like the second it comes out of my mouth, but seriously, make your best attempt at, like, if you think about it, what, how important it is to understand your history and relearn like, if history hasn't been told, you learn a new chapter, you hear a new chapter that hasn't been told. What is the role of, like, thinking about understanding history of activism itself, of the movements, and what role does that play in the present and future of the work?
So I just want to say one more thing that's sort of related to that, which was that when I was learning about Zilphia and Highlander, I'd never heard of Highlander till I learned of Zilphia, by the way. But when I was learning about it, everything I read was all about Miles had this great idea and did this thing, and it was Miles. And I realized, that's how we tell history, is there's this one hero at the center. They have this idea, the world bends to it, and what he achieves. It's always he. It's mostly white, cishet, Protestant, English-speaking American man. And I realized, like, that was a real problem in telling Zilphia's story, because she was about collaboration. And really what it comes down to is that this place, Highlander, never would have existed, just to go a little further on what these guys have said, without all these people and the collaboration and the participation. It wasn't, Miles had an incredible idea, yes, and all these people have continued to buy into it and build on it and collaborate and save the world. And so that became really my focus of, like, let me ignore that version of the narrative. Let me tell a story about a community of people and how they figured it out, in the middle of the Depression, and got to where, they wanted to, like, dismantle oppressive systems, but they were a bunch of white people in Middle Tennessee. And, how do they get to a better way? They had to actively, like, go outside of what they know and go outside of where they are and talk to people, that were outside of themselves. And, so, I mean, that was more of the story to me, like, learning about history and understanding that, like, that's really how change is made. My understanding of it now, that I didn't have when I started this book, is large amounts of people collaborating across differences. And it's not, you don't have to be the one hero straight white man to make a difference. So I think learning that is important to sort of shift your brain.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's history, and there's the way that it's told and why it's told that way. History is not something, like some, like, permanent object. It's a constructed story or series of stories. To the question in the chat, that I see, how much did Miles contribute or not to how that story was told? That could be a whole historiographical essay to get into the dominant narratives or stories or books or videos or whatever, dissertations, theses, master's theses, like a whole range of, a whole library could be filled with, like, how education is talked about, how social movements in the region are talked about, and why they were talked about in the 80s in a particular way versus the way they're being talked about now. And I think that's an important thing to hold. And I appreciate what you were saying, Kim, around, like, if I knew then what I understand now about how to tell this story, it might be framed differently. That's why there are 10th anniversary editions of books, and hopefully your book will sell that much to where you get a 10th to 25th anniversary, right? And I think that's important, because you can add layers to it. I mean, as someone who both is a student of history, but also looking at layers upon layers of how we talk about memory and the power, I think that's the difference, right? When you ask the question about what's the role of history, I think it's something to what Ash was talking about earlier around, it's about the role of remembrance and memory and how we shape our analysis and understandings of what the forces that brought us to this place, both positive and negative in terms of building something different. It's about how we remember that, because I think if you ask a whole host of people who have held on deeply to their cis hetero patriarchal ways of being, if we, as those people, I can be representative of those people, if we begin to remember like what it meant for, what it means for there to be radical white men who are cis het, who have been working over the last multiple centuries for liberation, whether they were calling it that or not, it changes the way that we even understand our own sense of dominance, right? Oh my goodness, I can actually claim a lineage of people who have thought like this, or who have acted like this, or have moved like this. So in one sense, it could be very powerful for an individual. It can certainly be very powerful for communities. And I think it's a way of understanding the role of the way that we talk about popular education, or before Highlander ever called it popular education, we called it adult education. That term has since gone out of fad for a whole bunch of reasons. But I think that when we talk about the role of education in terms of bringing people together to assess their situation, that's an act of remembering, right? That's an act of memory work that's being claimed, that's being recalled, retrieved from someone's lived experience, and then interpreted in a new particular way. I think the role of song in that is a very powerful thing to just tie it to this. It's song and art and cultural work and cultural organizing. I think is a very particular way that memory and history can be retrieved and brought into the present and shape our understanding of what's possible based on all the different things that we've learned. So I think the task of historians, whether they're art historians, musical historians, academics, so while we're talking to an academic field, or while we're in an academic context, is to be particularly responsible about naming the lineages and how stories are being told. I think there's a real slippery slope around individualizing people's contributions to movements, or contributions to whatever it may be, like to what you were talking about, Kim, around like white man history. But there's a whole field of historians who are boxed out of the academy because of their radical takes on like, no, we're going to have a real conversation about the role of social movements. If you're in a university setting and that's happening, that's white supremacist logic happening, right? So we have to be really clear that there's not some like political neutrality when it comes to the role of the academy in telling these stories. So don't want to lose the opportunity of speaking into an academic setting with that in mind, right? Our state legislatures dominate that stuff, right? And we need to be role playing about the role of this state legislature in Tennessee and what it's attempting to do and what it has attempted to do and what it might continue to attempt to do around erasing the ability to tell the stories from a plurality rather than just a single person. So I'll stop there.
There's a lot there.
Yeah, I didn't know Miles.
Sorry, Ashley, go ahead.
That's okay. I like can't answer Emily's question because I didn't know Miles. So I don't know how he told the story except for what I've been able to access and read that is the same stuff that you all could access and read, like The Long Haul, like We Make the Road by Walking, like the Bill Moyers interview, etc. So I can't speak to that. But he was a white dude. So I imagine he probably did sometimes center himself in ways that were problematic as all hell. And did it come from outside forces? Also probably and likely. In fact, I bet for those of you that knew the Highlander Center, if I asked you about Highlander, probably the first thing you would tell me is like, oh, Miles Horton did that. But guess what? There were at least 3 other people. At least one of them was a woman. The stories that don't get told, right? I think that this question is important because, typically, culture organizing and popular education, intergenerational organizing, place-based organizing, all the methodologies that we try to become experts in and share our expertise with social movements from Highlander's perspective are all older than whiteness, particularly older than whiteness in this country. So though Highlander's articulation of these things might have been unique in a particular moment where not only, as Kim pointed out, was it in the middle of a depression, it was also when it was still illegal for us to be able to do stuff like what we're doing right now, right? Very literally. And the way that you would gather people was also different because I couldn't just send you a graphic with my face on it with a Zoom link to register, right? Like, I think we need to make the absurdity of what they made possible obvious, right? That's why history matters. One reason, right? It's like cultural organizing is as old as indigenous people dancing and singing and eating together to negotiate boundaries, to negotiate relationship, to build mutual aid. That shit didn't start in the 21st century, right? It's cultural organizing is as old as the first enslaved African who was singing to their compatriots on those ships that we would rather choose death over this. And then once they got here, saying, you know what, like I'll wade in the water to get somewhere else to not be in this, right? Like it's not new, y'all. Like, and I think that part of the power of that is that it teaches me that I am not the first, last, or only to do this work. And why would I want to be? Why would I want to be? If individuals could save the world, we would have done it already, right? So to me, part of the reason that it's important to understand history is because it gets me to the win faster. And I'm going to be honest that the moment that I knew I wanted to be a scholar of movement history, a lifelong commitment to learning about how people build people power collectively, was because I realized that it did not serve me or my people for me not to know, but it did serve somebody else, and that pissed me off, right? I was angry that I had grown up to the point of being a 19-year-old that lived 2 hours away from Highlander, and I didn't know that. I was mad. Why did they not tell me that this sacred space was founded within a 45-minute drive from my house and was currently alive 2 hours up the road? I was mad. I was mad that I didn't know about the long history of Black radical tradition in Central Appalachia. Somebody had intentionally not told me, and I wanted to know why. And then when I realized why, I wanted to do everything in my power to circumvent that from ever happening to another marginalized or targeted community, right? So it's important because it actually then gives you the fervor to be able to sustain what are very, very difficult circumstances to build people power that is good for our communities and good for the planet, and not just concentrating the wealth and power of a small minority of really wealthy white dudes over everything, right? If you really want to win, you got to know the history. But I also think, like, particularly to Allyn's point, it's like the reality of having these sometimes challenging conversations about the history of a place or a movement can be difficult in academic settings, in part because it's not only who gets to tell the story, it's who actually owns it, right? Who owns the story, right? People write books about Black liberation movement all the time. There's several about the movement for Black lives already, and we're like 7 years old. How do we even know what to write about the movement for Black lives yet? But people are writing lots of books, and God bless them for it. But who gets to tell that story, and for the sake of what, right? For the sake of what? Who owns it then? Because I think that what's real is as much as I love public history, it also actually is someone's experience. It is, those stories is someone's inheritance, right? For me not to know about the long legacy of radical and revolutionary traditions of Central Appalachia, of Black movement in the South, et cetera, was to literally be, like, it was a theft of my cultural inheritance, right? And what happens is when we tell those this is why it's so important the way that Highlander does, like, participatory research and whatnot, because if we are taking those stories, extracting those stories from communities that we aren't necessarily from legacies that we want to be in proximity to, but we haven't necessarily gotten in the dirt with yet, then essentially what happens is we start benefiting off of proximity to a legacy of resistance that we are not sustaining or supporting. And who wants to do that? I don't think any of us want to do that, right? So there's something around what it means to collectively share a history, to collectively literally remember a history, and to make sure that the people who materially benefit off of that remembrance are the people that actually popularize that history in the first place, right? So I think history is important for a lot of reasons, including some of those.
Yeah. My silence is like, every time each of you speak, there's a lot to take in. I want to take notes in my head here. I think that's really true. And maybe in some ways, I think that, you know, Kim, in a couple places in your book, you talk about art as a hammer, right? You quote Brecht, you tell a story of when you were at the center and the writings that were put by the group you were meeting with on the wall, and one of them is about art being a hammer. And maybe in that way, you know, Ashley, I kind of want to interpret but not put words in your mouth, so please correct me if I'm not hearing it right. But I think in some ways, that story and that collective shared story being so important, if it can contribute to the hammer, you know, I mean, it's like, if you know it and it contributes to the hammer, and it has that purpose and not an ulterior purpose, right? Or not knowing its purpose, right? I mean, Kim, in reading your book, I feel the purpose. I feel the purpose in it, and I recognize the moment in which it seems like you had to make a choice. Like, I'm going to write this book, and it's going to include me. The story is in part about discovery, right? And it's interesting because your reaction, Ashley, to finding out about Highlander. Kim, you spoke earlier about when you found out about Highlander, and when I found out about Highlander, I also was like, how the hell did I not know about this? Like, what the heck how could I have learned about all these names of people and not have learned about Highlander? And I think it is a reaction of that type of emotion. But let's get to the hammer. So, you know, and I might come back to the spaghetti approach to activism if we have time, but I want to get into music. So, you know, how is music used to make change? You know, what songs come to mind? And Kim, will be remiss if we don't talk about the songs related to Zilphia's work. So, you know, what songs do we want to talk about first when it comes to using music? And how is music used?
Well, of course, you know, We Shall Overcome is always tied to Zilphia. Her name was on the, you know, Pete Seeger put her name on the copyright along with his own, and Guy Carwan and Frank Hamilton. But that song, you know, goes back to the, you know, like, as far as we know, it started in the 17th century and like went
can you
over
actually,
a long
like,
period of time.
yeah, can you share, Kim, what we know about that song? Because or, you know, because some students in the room might not know what we think we might know. So what do we know about We Shall Overcome?
Well, I'll start now and go backwards. So we know that you know, SNCC used it. It was like a song in the movement in the 60s. They were, you know, that sort of the story that's tied to that is Guy Carwan at the organizing convention of SNCC leading the song. But he had learned it from Zilphia, who had learned it from young black women who had organized for 5 months. They were striking for 5 months through the winter in Charleston, South Carolina, at the American Tobacco Company, mostly black women in their 20s. And there was a woman named Lucille Simmons who would sing it every day. She wouldn't let anybody go home until they sang this song. And then they, you know, women who were there, and, you know, they couldn't figure out if it was actually Lucille who brought it to Highlander, if it was another group of people that were there brought it to Highlander. And, you know, as part of what Zilphia did was she would ask people what songs they knew, which was a way of her sort of implicitly teaching them, you all have something to contribute, you know, what power do you come with? And so these women, you know, sang this song and talked about how they had sung it on the picket for 5 months. And so, you know, Zilphia sort of led the group in reworking it so that it would be just a couple of verses that could be applied to any situation. And they came up with 3 or 4 verses that then, you know, move forward into the civil rights movement. Pete Seeger added verses. There was a young woman whose name is escaping me in this moment, but a young teenager at Highlander during a police raid who added the verse, "We are not afraid." And so that was that. And then before Zilphia, before the Women of American Tobacco, there was a song published by another Black woman in Cincinnati named Louise Shropshire. And, you know, she really, I mean, really, that's the genesis of the modern version of that song that we know, with the melodic structure and the rhythmic structure that has made it to today. But before her, there was a guy named Charles Tinley, a white publisher, maybe 50 years earlier, who published it. Then before him, it was somebody else, and it goes all the way back. But pieces of that song have been really, it's been this collaborative evolution of that is rooted in the Black history, but has been added to by white folks and people all over the world over the course of centuries. You know, the melody stretches all the way back to the 1700s in Austria as a Christmas hymn. So it's impossible to pin it down, and many people have tried to sort of pin this like neat narrative, which again is part of that, like the patriarchal way we have to like rein history and make it perfect and linear. But it's really this collaborative history around that song. I could go on, but
I want to put a pin for a moment in sort of the lineage of copyright ownership and how problematic some of that can be. Not because it is not important, and it is important. Our students know a lot about copyright in the music business program, and they'll know that it, you know, to hear all this history before the song and then who owns the copyright at the beginning of your conversation is a whole other panel also that I would be happy to host. But one thing I do want to draw out from you, Kim, if you're willing, is something you're talking about this organic nature of taking songs that some people know in the community, the thought of how to make them singable in community. Maybe what's interesting to me around the idea of organizing is what makes a song a great song for protest or movement or action. Like, what makes a song work in that moment? What was some of the approaches and you know, that folks were taking at the center then? And then the follow on to that for Ashley and Allyn is, how is music used today, right? So just, you know, because there are folks in the room who really think about song structure and melody and what it means when you add a verse and how do you get a bunch of people to sing along. We've all been at a concert where an artist said, "Come sing along with me," and no one knew the words and couldn't sing along, right? So I wonder if you can talk for a minute about specifically music with respect to action.
Right. Well, I think that's a good point, because there's sort of two pieces to how music has been used. So there's recordings and performances, and, you know, what famous musicians do in order to rally support behind a cause or amplify things. There's that, which is important. But then there's the like on the ground organizing use of music to connect people, to empower people, to galvanize the people in a room, to also help a group of people who have traditionally not been heard to get heard. You know, there's one thing about screaming things in a bullhorn, but when you hear a group of people singing together, you know, "We shall overcome," or "We shall not be moved," or "This little light of mine," it's a different experience than listening to somebody preach at you through a bullhorn, or, you know, speechify at you. And so, you know, music, I tend to think of it as like a laser beam from my heart to your heart. And you think about like a group of people with all their laser beams, you know, there's something that defies discussion and debate. You can't disagree with "We shall overcome." There's no disagreement, you know, there's no opposition to that song. So, you know, what are you going to say in opposition to "We shall overcome," you know? So I think that's one big power that music has. And Zilphia, you know, for practical purposes, she was teaching people how to recognize songs that were useful, how to rewrite the words, how to simplify, because you don't want to give people a verse that has 100 words in it. You know, you want people to have one little hook that's going to stick in their heads, that they can sing at the march, they can sing on the job, and they can sing on the picket. And whoever hears them is going to go home with it ringing in their heads. So she would teach people how to do that. And the fact that somebody said something about, like, back before social media, how effective they were at organizing without, you know, sort of these big bullhorns that we have now of you know, Twitter and whatever. It's a testament to how effective that was, that, you know, she was able to distill everything down to such a concise way, and people would leave Highlander with these songs in the songbooks that she produced as well. But yeah, that was sort of in those days. People are doing a lot more effective and you know, timely things now that these guys can talk to you better than I can.
Ashley and Allyn, your thoughts on music now in action?
Yeah, I'm gonna get to now, but I think it's important to
Please.
get into a little.
That's cool.
Just in that, the copyright conversation is actually one that needs to be had.
Absolutely.
Right? Like, it actually wasn't particularly okay for Pete and Zilphia and Guy to copyright "We Shall Overcome." That's just to be real. I feel like I would be lying and doing my elders a disservice not to say that, like, their copywriting of a song that was not theirs, that did belong to the Black liberation struggle of the 20th century, led to what ultimately ended up being some good, the We Shall Overcome Fund, that some of those very Black activists who popularized the song, who literally put their lives on the line popularizing the song, created, and had Highlander steward to send the royalties from We Shall Overcome. Now, I imagine, how many, can you wave at me if you've sung We Shall Overcome? Can you just wave at me? You've ever sung that song? Yeah, a bunch of us. Have you ever paid a penny to sing it? If you have, just keep waving at me. Anybody ever paid to sing We Shall Overcome? Okay, so probably not. Like, if you ever sang it at a march or a mass meeting or whatever, you probably haven't been charged, right? But there are people who were using the song either in movies or other things, that did pay royalties on that song. And those royalties went into a pot that would then be re-granted out to Black communities in the South that were doing organizing work at the nexus of art and activism. You know, so it ended up being something for good. And then there was a lawsuit that ultimately raveled out in me and Allyn's earliest years as co-executive directors, that put the first verse at least back in the public domain, which then was another harmful thing to the infrastructure for Black liberation movement in the South, right? So there can be unintended consequences. And though it is beautiful, this shared history of contributing to the power of the song, there's also a real fine line around when does it become cultural appropriation that does harm and not just good, right? There is a line. So what I don't want you to hear from what Kim said is like, just take all these songs that you hear Black people singing and change the words a little bit and put it on your Facebook and that'll make it all good. That is not what she said. That is not what she said. So I just want to be clear about that. Cultural appropriation is messed up, y'all. And the way that the law, copyright law in particular, is used to disempower Black communities is jacked up. But what I would say about the sort of segue to the now is stuff that Dr. Bernice Johnson Reagan taught me, stuff that the SNCC Freedom Singers taught me, is that, you know, freedom singing is not a solo event, right? And it's not about your entertainment. SNCC Freedom Singers didn't do those concerts just because it made you feel good. They did it because, one, it was a fundraising tactic. Two, because they were literally speaking truth to power. It was political education through song, right? It was giving a marching order through song, right? Those songs in the field, and I mean that both literally even prior to the 50s and 60s, songs that enslaved Africans sang, or that people sang when they were out in the streets and protest, et cetera, were literally to generate a feeling, to explain a vision, and to dictate a destination, right? So those things are important. And what's also real about singing together is that it if we can't breathe together, what makes us think that we'll be able to, like, you know, govern together, right? It's like, if we can't do the little things, the little synchronous things, then what makes us think we can do the rest of it? That all feels important to me about if you are a person that's using art of any modality for the sake of freedom building. And the last two things I would say is that, to Allyn's earlier point, there's no neutrality, right? Your art is either bending the moral arc of the universe towards justice, or it's hindering its ability to be bent, right? There's no middle ground. So when it comes to freedom singing, it's like, you're either doing it or you're not. You're either doing it or you're not. There's no middle ground, right? But the beauty about it is, when you get it right, it doesn't matter if it sounds good. It doesn't matter, you know, to Kim's earlier point, it doesn't, I remember literally, this is a Dr. Regan story. The first time I ever met Bernice Johnson Regan, we were in a church in Mississippi. I think we were at Tougaloo, in fact. I think we were in the chapel at Tougaloo College. And she was like singing, and nobody else was singing. And she was like, oh, no. Like, that's not how this works. And then you could see, like, a lot of white, it was a mixed race space. You could see all the white people start getting really anxious. And you know, the squirming, like, oh God,
we're gonna sing in a minute, everyone. Just to get prepared. Go ahead, Ashley.
Get prepared. So they got super nervous. You could see, like, the really anxious ones about to raise their hand, being like, I don't know the words of these songs. And she was like, it doesn't matter. Because it actually, if you just let yourself be, you will spiritually move. There's no way you won't. There's no way you won't. So if you just open your heart and mind to being present in communion with these other people, that you won't have a choice. The melody, the words will come, right? So that, to me, the other, like, fundamental thing about freedom singing is it's a secular or no, it's a spiritual experience. And let me break down what I mean by that. If you've ever, okay, so like some of y'all have sang We Shall Overcome. Okay, that's dope. Did you have any material evidence that was true? Was there any physical manifestation of your potentiality of winning that you could scientifically prove in that moment? I doubt it, right? For younger people, if you've ever chanted, I believe that we will win, or ain't no power like the power of the people because the power of the people don't stop, prove it.
Yeah.
And if you can't, then I was taught that is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. Whether you believe in a deity or not is irrelevant to me, right? So there's something about the spiritual nature of cultural work and organizing that says art plus culture and faith and spirit changes policy and practice. That's the methodology, right? So if whatever you're creating confuse those things and be engulfed by community power, there's no way you don't shift policy, practices, and procedure in your community, point blank, period. So to the now, who do I know that's doing that? Shout out to BYP 100, shout out to Highlander's cultural organizer, Janae Taylor. I think about, like, her song, I Love Being Black. We've heard it sung. I've literally sang it in the South. I've sung it in South Africa. People love it. That one's maybe just for a few of us on this call, though. But the album, The Black Joy Experience, is for everybody. What we learned through that process is that those freedom songs, those chants, those incantations brought joy to everybody, even though the origin of it was Black joy. We had them come to the Highlander Center to do a workshop on the Black Joy Experience, and it was an interracial space. And by the time people left, folks were like, man, that Black joy stuff, it'll save the world. And I totally believe that, right? I think there are contemporary artists like Nathaniel Rateliff and the Night Sweats, you know, that have the Marigold Project and are being led by folks like Carrie Knott, doing amazing work, right? I think there's so many more examples of folks that are doing that. I think about the Seeds of Fire youth and their incredible chant, like, I see you, I love you, and I respect you, and I want you to be free, right? Like, there's so many people who are, Nalini Stamp, right? Like, there's so many people who are doing it in a contemporary way that again, I think that's a whole nother couple of hours to break down. But to me, if I was talking to other culture bearers, artists, artivists, creatives, creators, all of which are different things. I would say the base of expectation around how to develop 21st century relevant freedom songs or art for freedom's sake would be, it's not about a solo, it's about a collective. If we can't sing it together or enjoy it together, then you didn't do it. If it doesn't encourage us to breathe together and practice the small ways that we can build collectively, then we didn't do it. If it doesn't provoke a vision or a destination or a feeling that gets us through to power building, if it doesn't leave you with more power, we didn't do it. And yeah, if it's not rooted in spirit, it's not freedom sing.
Allyn, anything to add before we go to Q&A?
Not a whole lot. I do think the difference between, if we're talking about difference between songs that we like and that we like enjoy and sing, you know, out loud to ourselves or even as a group, is that the work of cultural organizing and song is about like what is essential to our collective struggle and what's essential to our collective hope, right? It's like those are the pieces, whether it's a long song or a short phrase or a chant or something like that, that's what ties it together. And I think that it's also about not just what is heard or spoken, but it's also what's felt, right? To be really clear that, you know, a beat can be a song and it can be felt and it doesn't necessarily need to be heard, so that it's something that really can move across a lot of abilities and invite a lot of different kind of participation.
One more thing about the music is that, you know, it changes people's heart, you know, which is, I mean, you can, changing your mind is hard, but when your heart changes, it's all over. Like you can't, you know, it's louder than what your brain is telling you. And so I think that good music changes people's heart.
Questions for folks. Folks, you have questions for our speakers. If you like to ask a question, you can type question and put your question in the chat, or you can use the reactions button to raise your hand and let us know you'd like to ask a question. If you have an older version of Zoom, that reactions, that raise hand button is under your participants button. But any questions? I have a million more questions, but I'm gonna give a little space here for anyone who's nervous to ask a question but has one. You won't get hurt. Very friendly speakers today who want your questions. I'll ask another question. And I encourage anyone who wants to ask a question, raise your hand. And there's a question I didn't get to. So again, put your questions in the chat, put the little raise your hand button up. I had a question that was 5 questions in a row. It was really just meant for y'all to pick whatever part you want to answer. And Dawn typed one early in the chat that I missed. Okay, let's look for Dawn's question. Where is Dawn's question? Dawn, are you there? Would you like to ask your question? Would you like us to read your question? Dawn Cameron. What current laws or regulations are oppressing Black Americans today, and what can us young people do to help change these laws and regulations? What steps can we take to get involved to stop oppression? Maybe get involved with local elections to help change laws? Question mark. That's a great question. Thank you for calling my attention to that, Ashley. And if y'all want to go ahead and go for that, I'll also copy and paste it back in the chat so you can see the full question. But what are your thoughts, folks?
I'm definitely down to answer that. I wonder if, for the sake of time, if you want to give us a few, and then we can go through them all. So maybe Michelle, if you want to still ask.
I think that first one, yeah. So, well, I'll give you Dawn's question, and then I'll also give you these others. So you got Dawn's question about laws and regulations. What can young folks do? What steps can we take? Are there organizations we should be involved in? And Dawn raises the local elections, and of course, with you know, we're learning a lot from Georgia and Atlanta and what's going on there in terms of some organizing. You know, a lot of us are saying, what can we do around voting and the legislation that's happening. The questions I had are more about this sort of spaghetti on the wall approach versus truly organizing, right? So my questions were, you know, do you think modern movements are organized? And, you know, as a place that has such a long history in real actual organization, you talked about the tactical brilliance of earlier, Ashley, about some of the actions that happened in the past. When you reflect on movements you've been involved in with Highlander or anywhere, participated, witnessed, or organized, why do you think some were more effective than others? How would you describe the people involved, and what made those efforts more or less effective? Like, what can we learn from when you think things have gone well and when you think things have gone poorly around organized action? So these are somewhat related questions, honestly. So thoughts? Any one of you?
Cool. I guess I can start with the policy question.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So I think I would argue that likely every law in the United States is disproportionately impacting Black American people and Black people across the diaspora. But the good news is that Black people are also writing our own policy demands these days. And you saw, Don, in response to the question, Allyn dropped one piece of policy that Black folks in the US are really pushing hard for, called the Breathe Act. So that's one thing to check out. It truly is, I think, the love letter to the streets of folks that rebelled last year, revolted last year, and set a mandate for a shift in this country's relationship to white supremacy and anti-Black racism last year by saying that essentially 4 things: that we need to divest from punitive bureaucracy, right? We need to divest from policing, which we know doesn't keep us safe. We need to divest from mass incarceration. And when I say mass incarceration, I mean all of the kinds of incarceration, including detention centers. When I talk about policing, I mean Custom and Border Patrol, I mean ICE agents, not just our municipal cops, right, et cetera. And that those dollars need to be invested into building healthy, sustainable, and equitable communities for all people, particularly Black people. That benefits everybody. And then that there should be more streamlined resources and new pots of money to make sure that our people have what they need, and that communities continue to be incentivized to move away from those systems of harm. And that there's something legislatively that holds elected officials accountable to our demands. I'd also say check out the Vision for Black Lives policy platform that we launched in 2016 that's being relaunched in its 2nd version now. Highlander's been heavily involved in that process and serves on the leadership team of the policy table of the Movement for Black Lives. And then I would shout out some of the other things that we're seeing the Biden administration and the 117th Congress start to move, stuff like the Thrive Act. You know, I think it's really important to recognize that we would not have gotten this kind of stimulus, this trillions of dollars in stimulus support, had it not been for us making it politically impossible for them not to give us something, right? And I think that most people saw November as like, oh, cool, we can like relax because Biden's gonna be in there and we've got the squad and that's awesome, so we can chill. It's like, no, loved ones, neoliberalism will kill us slowly. And so there's a desire and a need for us to keep building this big we that can continue to put pressure even on elected officials that might be a little bit closer to our side to ensure that they do the transformative change that they should do. So in terms of like folks to check out, I would say check out the Movement for Black Lives, check out the Rising Majority, which is the sort of multiracial united front in this country that has been pushing for transformative change. And then I would say, check out the Frontline. It was the campaign that I think really made all the difference in the elections, both in November and in January, and is continuing to put pressure during the first 100 days in national work. And then if you're interested in the state, like in Tennessee stuff, check out like Tennessee Organizing for Power statewide. They're doing incredible work. It's a new formation that's bringing people together. Check out like the members of the Working Families Party in the state, right? Like if we want something transformative, we've got to build it. And so Highlander's been lucky to be able to be involved and work with a lot of different kinds of folks in a lot of different kinds of places to do some of that work. And I would check those out to start. Also, just like holler at Highlander, if you're ever trying to find some work to get into, there's plenty of it to go around. We'd love to get you connected.
It's really helpful.
I just say real close to y'all, or at least close to MTSU, Bedford County, nearby in Bedford County, there's a project called the Bedford County Listening Project that has been pushing for tenant rights and folks who are being pushed out or discriminated against in their own housing. And you should totally check them out and throw down alongside them. And a recent leader from that group, Stephanie Isaacs, is helping lead Bedford County now as an elected official and has been doing some really amazing work to protect tenants across race, across difference, across all kinds of things, but poor and working class folks whose landlords are just not doing them any favors, and much less their existing elected officials. So like check out Bedford County Listening Project. It's a sub project of a group called Southern Crossroads, which is a sub project of a group called Showing Up for Racial Justice. So check all that out. Yeah.
And see Pamela Jean McMichael on the call.
Oh,
So
did
shout out
Pam,
to
is Pam, was that the Pam who dropped that? Okay. Yeah, one of the,
shout out to Pam.
yeah, totally.
One of the founders. And then to your question, Michelle, around organizing versus tactical spaghetti at the wall, I want to be one is that, you know, if it was between fascism and tactical spaghetti at the wall, throw the tactical spaghetti at the wall, right? It's not to say that there aren't times that require us to just try everything, right? And I think November of 2020 was one of those moments where it was like, oh, it's not promised that we won't, you know, be in a real slippery, quick descent into fascism and authoritarianism and white nationalism in the highest executive powers of this country. But I do think that there's a difference between like having a strategy that we identify tactics to change and to get to a strategic goal versus just, you know, randomly experimenting. And I think we have to find the happy medium, right? Organizing to me is about building power. It's about building a base, right? It's about having like people in the community that have collective vision and are taking collective action versus just mobilizing people to protest or mobilizing people to sign a petition or mobilizing people to vote or mobilizing people to do one tactic. And I think we need some more space. That's why Highlander is so important to me, is that it creates space for people to actually think about strategy, to actually learn how to build power, how to do, like, I think sometimes we make finger painting into rocket science. Like some of this is really just about learning to talk to people, right? And be in community with each other, practice learning together and then doing some stuff. And so to me, you know, if folks are trying to learn how to organize, the root to me is like a process that I learned in my political ideology. It's like you come up with a theory. I think this is happening. This is the problem. This is my utopian vision that would alleviate that problem. This is the faithful next step I could take towards that utopian vision. What's my theory of change, right? And then to practice it. See if the thing that I theorized, the strategy that I built, could work in the implementation phase, right? I got to be doing something. Organizing is a doing word. You don't just think or value organizing, you do it. So you practice it. And then you don't just keep practicing it over and over and over again without doing any sort of evaluation and assessment about whether or not it's getting you more power or not, right? If it's working or not. So you got to sum it up. You got to get together with your people and say, like, is this working? Did we move the needle, right? Qualitatively and quantitatively. And then start the process again. Theory, practice, and summation. Theory, practice, and summation over and over again. And I think we've gotten really good at flexing the muscle of rapid response.
Yeah.
And I think we've got to keep working out that other muscle around some of that long haul strategy building, what it looks like to have, you know, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 50, 100-year strategies, because certainly our opposition is building it.
Yeah, it's almost like the most visible moments that happen are those muscle flexing moments, and that's what people come to think is the work. And I mean, when you look at some of the things that y'all have done in terms of timing of when things are done, the timing of conversations versus, you know, strikes, and what do you think is the best way? You think the best way for students to learn about that is to sign up and show up and do it? Are there places they can learn more to educate themselves further and how to becoming, you know, an active member of that style of work.
When my elders and ancestors said by any means necessary, they meant by all the means. So get in where you fit in. Like, don't let perfection be the enemy of the world saving good, right? Like, if how you get mobilized is because you're mad that a cop killed a Black person, or because your working conditions are trash, or because you care about saving the planet from, you know, climate disasters or whatever, just get in. But do a Google search and see if anybody else around you is doing it. Right? That's like step number one. Step number two is, if nobody truly is doing it in the way that you want to do it, where you want to do it, see if you can find 2 or 3 other homies that would do it with you, right? And then do it and see where in other places other people are doing it. Because again, you're not the first, last, or only to be doing this work. So I think we won't let tactical interventions be the enemy of the good here. Get in where you can. But I do believe that the way that this country, this world will be transformed is through the vehicle of organization. I believe that. I don't think you can actually sustain your wins if you are not in an organization, if you can win in the first place. So I think it's really, really critical that we do both, right? And also, again, this is like back to what me and Kim and Allyn were talking about earlier around like how to tell a story about the history of the work. It's like, if you believe that last year happened in the vacuum away from organizing, you are confused. People have been organizing for abolition since the 1800s, right? That's not a new demand, right? Like, we are building on legacies of organizing traditions. If you think we popularized defund the police in a month just because George Floyd was murdered, I hate to tell you, but we've been talking about divest, invest since like 2016 as the movement for Black Lives, and folks were talking about it before we existed, right? So it takes good organizing. Like, nobody can control a rebellion. What happened last year, no one organization can claim, right? No one social movement can claim, right? The conditions created a situation, cumulative Black death, the COVID-19 stuff, lots of intersecting crises led to what happened last year. But the ability to then catalyze, to use a very Highlander word, to be catalytic, right? To be the agitator that then figures out how to sustain that uprising, figures out how to absorb all those new people, figures out how to electoralize it, because we had an election for our lives right after it. All of that required organization, required organizing, required strategy development, required really intentional tactical interventions. That folks like the Movement for Black Lives, like the Rising Majority, like United We Dream, like the Working Families Party, and so many other folks really spent a lot of time and energy doing. I mean, in fact, the secret to be told, Highlander essentially let me go just do that work for the last year to help to support and sustain it. And that's why Highlander is so important, is that capacity building support that we are able to give.
I think what strikes me, in addition to many other things that strike me from what you're saying, but when I try to think about we're coming on the end of our time here together, when you talk about a long strategy and a long story that we're all part of, and Kim, when I look at your book as a story of a moment in time in the movement, right? And we are in another moment of time in the movement, and this story is about one person doing the best they could with their moment in time, right? Given what they knew and what they had at their disposal. And I think it brings us all to reflect on what is our moment in time, and how can we contribute to this moment in time. So I don't want to end this, but I gotta. And we had some other questions in the chat. Many of them actually you answered as you were speaking. A couple you didn't. There was a question about copyright, which I do really want. I invite a whole other I would actually have a whole other conversation about copyright. I think that's really a smart idea, because we have some folks who would like to be involved in that for sure. There's also some remarks with Bridget didn't have a question mark, but her remarks are very spot on. And the question being, in this time in COVID and new technology being inserted into the ability to organize, I think is a real opportunity of connection and this notion of sitting in the moment. So I encourage everyone to look at the chat on Bridget's remarks there, and if you have thoughts.
This question's important. Just saying, like, just because the mics for everybody aren't on doesn't mean you can't sing, right? Like just have one. We do community sings all the time. Shout out to Wendy O'Neill down in New Orleans, one of the new co-executive directors of Southerners on New Ground. She hosts a community sing almost every weekend, at least one a month for sure since COVID started. And you just come together. You have one person lead. You turn the mics off, and everybody can see each other singing, jamming out. Like physical distance. That's what Highlander means, right? Is that like physical distance does not have to stop social solidarity. So still sing. Do it. You do it.
Yeah, I actually love that. I've loved that during concerts, seeing fans sing along when artists are I won't lie, I've done it, but yeah, I think about it, I'm like, I thought earlier when we were talking about, you talking about it doesn't have to sound great. I've many times, in my youth been to church where people would sing. I mean, my mother is wonderful and she would enthusiastically sing, and now it's recorded that I'm saying this, but her love and her desire to sing sounded good. I mean, you might not record it, but her passion for it overcame any amount of discomfort I felt with all of my friends in the room, right? But I think that's real. I love that message. And I love the message that we are all singers at that point, right? We go through this whole, there's professional singers, but when it comes to this, we're all singers, right? I'm going to bring Greg back. We're just going to kind of wrap up. Final thoughts and bring us home.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. That point you just made reminded me of an old story that a lot of us musicologists know and like to repeat about the American composer Charles Ives, and actually it's about his father, George Ives, who was a Connecticut a church musician and choral leader, and he had a small group in his little town church, and they got together and sang, not just every Sunday, but at other times as well. And there's a story about at one point another musician, a trained musician from New York, was passing through, and he came through and he listened to this group, and he heard this one guy in the group who was singing like louder than everybody else and singing out of tune, and so after the event, he went up to George Ives and said, "How can you let that guy sing in your group? With that voice, and that he can't carry a tune." And he said, "Try not to." Let me get the wording right exactly. He said, "Try not to listen too much to the singing, or you might miss the music." By which he meant what this guy brings to the table is the spirit behind it. And he might sing out of tune, but boy, he more than makes up for it with everything else that he brings in spirit. So I want to thank Kim and Ashley and Allyn, of course, and Michelle for working so hard to organize this event. But especially I want to thank all of the viewers and participants. We're talking about organizing, right? So the panelists could get together and talk about these things, but they have a lot more power and a lot more meaning when we're all together to share in this discussion. So thanks to all of you. It is going to be viewable after the fact. If you'd like to go back, or if you'd like to share that information with anybody, the Center for Popular Music YouTube channel. I just put I'm sorry, I sent that to Michelle. I'm putting the link in, and I've put it in a couple of times already, but that link is going to disappear as soon as we close the meeting. So the easier way to remember it is just go to YouTube and search for the Center for Popular Music, and you will find it immediately. It'll probably take a few days before we have a chance to get it up on YouTube, but it will be there. So feel free to go back and enjoy it, be inspired by it. It's a wonderful conversation today. Thanks to all of our speakers and all of our participants. Please go out and get yourself a copy of Kim's book. Go to your local bookseller and order a copy of Kim's book. Check out the Highlander Center's website. Find ways that you can get involved in whatever way that works for you. That's the important thing, as many people have said today already. So thanks to you all, and enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks.
Thank you very much, folks. Take care. Appreciate you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks, y'all. Thanks, Michelle. Bye.